The sea has a way of holding onto secrets, its rhythmic waves washing over the jagged rocks of the small coastal town like a constant rhythmic lullaby. In this quiet corner of Japan, where time seemed to slow down under the weight of the salt-heavy air, Haru and Hana were more than just neighbors. They were two souls woven together by years of shared silence and unspoken understanding. Since they were children, they had been inseparable. Walking the same paths to school and watching the sunset from the same crumbling seawall. Their bond was evident in the smallest of gestures, the way Haru would wordlessly adjust his umbrella to keep the rain off Hana's shoulder, or how Hana could tell exactly what he was thinking just by the subtle tilt of his head. To an outsider, they were a perfect match, a romance waiting for its first chapter to be written. But inside Haru, a storm was brewing that no one else could see, a tempest of doubt that kept his heart anchored in place. Haru was a man of quiet success and steady hands, but when it came to Hana, his heart was a fragile, trembling thing. He loved her with a depth that terrified him to his very core. For years, he had lived in the comfort of their friendship, a sanctuary he was too afraid to disturb. To confess his feelings was to risk the only world he knew and cherished. What if she didn't feel the same? What if the words, "I love you," became a wall instead of a bridge, shattering the delicate peace they had cultivated? This fear acted as a paralyzing barrier, a cage of his own making that kept his heart under lock and key. He convinced himself that having her as a constant presence in his life was enough, that the proximity of her laughter was a fair trade for the silence of his own desires. Yet every time he saw her smile, the weight of the truth grew heavier, pressing against his chest like a leaden weight. Hana, for her part, lived in a state of quiet, aching longing. She dropped hints like fragile breadcrumbs, hoping Haru would finally find his way to her heart. She would linger at the garden gate a few seconds longer than necessary, her eyes searching his for a sign that never seemed to come. She saw the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, a gaze full of such raw tenderness it made her breath catch in her throat, but the words remained trapped behind his lips. She didn't want to be the one to break the equilibrium, fearing that if she pushed too hard, he might pull away entirely into his own shell. So she waited, anchored to this coastal town by a hope that was beginning to fray at the edges as the reality of adulthood loomed on the horizon. Their shared sanctuary was the old lighthouse on the cliff's edge. It was a place of ghosts and wind, where the ocean's roar drowned out the need for trivial conversation. There, the tension between them was most palpable, vibrating in the cool air between them. They would sit on the weathered stone steps, shoulders almost touching, watching the light sweep across the dark, restless water. In those moments, the air was thick with everything they weren't saying, a heavy, electric vibration that felt like it could shatter at any moment. But every time the silence became too much to bear, one of them would make a trivial comment about the weather, and the opportunity would vanish into the spray of the sea. The arrival of high school graduation changed everything. The news of Hana's acceptance to a prestigious university in Tokyo hit the town like a sudden, unexpected frost. The ticking clock of their youth was suddenly loud and unrelenting. The summer festival was meant to be their last great memory together. Dressed in her yukata, Hana looked like a dream under the glow of the paper lanterns. The atmosphere was perfect, the smell of grilled street food and the intimacy of the crowd. As the fireworks began to bloom, Haru turned to her, his heart hammering. He was going to say it. He was going to tell her he couldn't imagine life without her. But just as he opened his mouth, a group of boisterous classmates stumbled into them, breaking the spell and scattering his courage. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The day of departure arrived with a cold gray dawn at the small train station. Hana stood by the carriage door, her eyes red-rimmed and expectant. She was giving him one last chance to give her a reason to stay. Haru stood on the platform, his hands clenched into fists in his pockets. The whistle blew, a sharp, mournful sound. As the train began to groan, Haru watched Hana's face through the glass. The words burned in his throat, a silent scream that refused to escape. He raised a hand in a stiff wave, his face a mask of stoic regret. As the train pulled away toward Tokyo, Haru realized he had let her go. He watched the red lights disappear, leaving him alone with the crushing realization that he had just lost his only chance at happiness. The seasons in the coastal town turned with a rhythmic cruelty. Spring blossoms gave way to summer humidity, and autumn leaves eventually surrendered to winter winds. Haru remained, a fixed point in a world moving on without him. He found success in a local firm, his designs reflecting the sturdy seawalls of his youth. On paper, his life was enviable, a professional with a home overlooking the bay. Yet, the silence reminded him of the space Hana used to occupy. Their communication had started as a flood of long, handwritten letters, filled with the scent of the sea and the frantic energy of Tokyo. But as the years bled into one another, the letters thinned into occasional emails, then into brief, perfunctory text messages. Their shared emotional landscape was eroded by distance and divergent paths. In Tokyo, Hana was transforming. She was no longer the girl who waited, she was a woman who made her own waves. She spoke of deadlines and a new circle of friends that Haru couldn't possibly imagine. She began mentioning a colleague, a man who shared her passion and understood the woman she was becoming. It was a subtle provocation, a final attempt to see if Haru would finally reach out and claim the space he had left vacant. Driven by a sudden, desperate surge of courage, Haru finally booked a ticket to Tokyo. He arrived feeling like a ghost, his lungs struggling with the city's heavy air. At a crowded cafe, the woman before him was a stranger dressed in professional confidence. She was constantly checking her phone, her eyes darting toward the clock as she discussed her latest project. The girl from the lighthouse was buried under layers of metropolitan hustle, and the distance between them expanded. Tension finally boiled over in a hollow argument over a misplaced restaurant reservation. On a rain-slicked sidewalk, they shouted about logistics while their hearts screamed about years of neglect. It was a proxy war, a way to vent the frustration of a love that had been allowed to stagnate in the shadows. Hana looked at him with eyes full of a tired, cold disappointment that hurt more than any shouting, her breath hitching in the damp city air. Haru left that night without saying the words he had traveled hundreds of miles to deliver. He realized that while he had been frozen in time, she had been forced to grow up, to build a life that didn't have a pre-carved space for a childhood friend who refused to speak. Back in his lonely hotel room, surrounded by the city's neon glow, Haru poured his soul into a letter. Ink bled into paper as he confessed every hidden thought, every moment of longing and the paralyzing fear that had kept him silent at the train station all those years ago. He wrote about the specific way her laughter used to echo against the lighthouse walls and the crushing weight of the almosts that defined their history. But when morning came, the old cowardice returned. He couldn't face the vulnerability of her potential rejection, or worse, her pity. He tucked the letter into a well-worn book of poetry he had intended to give her, hiding his heart between lines of verse written by someone else. He left Tokyo without giving her the book or the letter, returning to the coast. He retreated into his work, using the blueprints of buildings to distract himself from the crumbling architecture of his own life. He convinced himself there would be a better time, a moment of perfect clarity that would make everything right. Then, on a Tuesday like any other, the digital notification arrived. It wasn't a text or a casual update. It was a formal, elegant invitation, the font scrolling across his screen with a cold, clinical beauty. Hana was getting married. The man she was pledged to was the colleague from her stories, the man who had been present when Haru was absent. The ceremony was set to take place in a month, and the location hit Haru like a physical blow. It was to be held at a grand venue near their old coastal home. The salt air mingled with the scent of expensive lilies at the grand venue overlooking the sea. Haru walked through the heavy oak doors, his suit feeling like armor that offered no protection against the hollow ache in his chest. He wasn't there to play the hero of a cinematic romance. He wasn't there to stop the ceremony. He was there to bear witness to the finality of his own long-standing silence. Each guest's laughter felt like a needle pricking his skin, a sharp reminder of the life he could have claimed if he had possessed the courage to speak. The coastal wind outside howled, a familiar sound that echoed the turmoil he had suppressed for over a decade. Minutes before the ceremony, a strange impulse led him toward the bridal suite. He found her alone, a vision in white silk that seemed to glow against the dark mahogany furniture. Hana turned, her veil a sheer mist around her face, her eyes widening as they landed on him. For a fleeting moment, the years of distance and the bitter arguments in Tokyo vanished. The air became thick with the suffocating weight of 1,000 what-ifs that had haunted their footsteps since childhood. Her eyes, still the same deep amber that mirrored the sunset over their lighthouse, searched his face for a sign, a word, or any spark of the fire he had kept hidden for so long. The silence that had been their sanctuary and their prison finally shattered. In a raw, desperate surge of emotion, Haru's voice cracked the stillness. He told her everything. He spoke the 3 words he had buried under a decade of excuses, letting them fall between them like heavy stones. "I love you, Hana. I have always loved you." The revelation did not bring relief. Instead, it brought a devastating wave of grief. Hana's hands trembled violently as she clutched her bouquet, and the first tear traced a silver path down her cheek. She did not look like a happy bride. She looked like a woman who had been told the truth too late to save her. Through her rising sobs, the cruel irony of their lives poured out. She confessed that every letter she had sent, and every long look shared at the lighthouse, had been a silent plea for him to claim her. She had waited 10 long years, lingering in the doorway of her own life, hoping he would finally ask her to stay or tell her to come back. She told him that she was only standing in this white dress because she had finally convinced herself that his silence was a form of rejection. The irony was a jagged blade. He had stayed silent because he was terrified of losing her, and in doing so, he had ensured he would lose her forever. The guests were already seated, the music was swelling, and her life was promised to a man who had actually possessed the strength to speak. They shared one final heartbreaking embrace in that quiet room, a desperate cling to the ghost of a future that would never exist. It was an acknowledgement that while their love was the most real thing they had ever known, their cowardice had been the stronger force. When they finally pulled apart, the distance between them was no longer measured in miles, but in the permanent finality of a choice made too late. Haru watched her walk toward the door, her silhouette framed by the golden light of a life he would never share. He stood in the shadows as the wedding march began, knowing that the most tragic silence is the one that lasts forever. Years later, Haru stood once again at the base of the lighthouse, the salt spray chilling his skin. He was older and profoundly alone. The beacon of light swept across the dark waves, illuminating the restless water just as it had when they were children. He realized then that some opportunities do not wait for the perfect moment. They do not linger in the shadows, waiting for us to find our courage. They simply vanish, leaving behind only the crushing weight of the things we should have said. The sea continued its rhythmic pull, a constant reminder that the most tragic stories are not the ones where love dies, but the ones where love is never given a voice.